We lift our eyes to stars that were gone before their light arrived. We move among crowds and clocks, pages and glass, trying to hold a shape that keeps dissolving. Every path.
Welcome to the debate. The topic today is, well, it's a big one. The nature and significance of the existential crisis. We're drawing from material that discusses its pretty profound philosophical and psychological dimensions.
Right. And the source material, it doesn't just talk about anxiety, does it? It frames it as this deep confrontation, with things like alienation, mortality, and that really fundamental, often quite painful search for meaning. We're looking at how thinkers, everyone from Nietzsche to Camus and Sartre, have tried to make sense of this critical moment.
Exactly. So the central question we're wrestling with today is this. Is the existential crisis fundamentally a positive thing? A universal catalyst for real transformative growth, this necessary breakthrough that actually demands we kind of author ourselves. Or is it something else? Is it maybe an unavoidable, inherently painful condition that's really defined by this inescapable, maybe irresolvable tension between contingency and arbitrariness?
A tension that perhaps never really goes away.
Precisely. So, for my part, I'll be arguing that the crisis is, in fact, a crucial constructive call, a call to self-awareness and growth, something actually necessary for, well, developmental integration.
And I'll be taking the position that emphasizes the persistent pain, the irresolvable tension that's caused by the arbitrary nature of existence itself. I see the crisis more as a permanent, enduring condition, rather than just some kind of preparatory stage you pass through on the way to resolution.
Okay, so my core position, as I see it, is that this existential crisis isn't just some negative pathology we need to cure. It's presented as a profound, even necessary breakthrough, a decisive call to self-awareness. Now, confronting the randomness of existence, yeah, it's painful. Absolutely. But the material suggests that pain is functional. It actually says pain acts as a doorway to truth. I mean, think about it. We only really become aware of our physical body when a limb hurts, right? And similarly, the argument goes, we only become truly conscious of our authentic self, or the lack thereof, when we suffer the weight of inauthenticity or meaninglessness. This suffering, it kicks off a critical developmental shift. It compels the individual to move from just acting reactively, chasing external rewards, following inherited values, to recognizing themselves as an agent capable of choosing. And this shift, it's so foundational that the material even lays out a kind of structured roadmap towards self-authorship.
I certainly agree. That the crisis gets the philosophical wheels turning, no doubt about that. But framing it as this sort of predictable path to a solved self, or reaching some stable state of being yourself, I think that minimizes the defining feature here, which is the constant tension. The tension at the very heart of the existential condition. And that condition, I would argue, is fundamentally painful and uncertain, precisely because the core dilemma doesn't just vanish. We're presented with these two inescapable forces, as the material lays out. First, there's contingency. That's everything thrown upon us, right? Echoing Heidegger's thrownness, where we were born, our family, our historical context, our inherent limits.
The givens, yeah.
Exactly, the givens. And second, there's arbitrariness. That's the, frankly, terrifying recognition of this vast, undefined freedom we have. The complete lack of an inherent purpose or script for our lives. And these two forces, what's sort of done to us versus the massive, undefined freedom of what we can do, they create this constant, irresolvable conflict. The real difficulty isn't just having the freedom to choose, it's the sheer scope of that choice without any external guidance or map. This is where we bump up against Camus's absurd, isn't it? That deep human yearning for rational meaning in a universe that seems completely silent and indifferent. And I maintain that this absurd condition is a permanent feature of existence, not just some developmental stage we can overcome by following a roadmap. And look, I'm sorry, but I just don't quite buy the structural certainty you seem to attach to the pain.
You're framing it as primarily a functional mechanism for growth, but the suffering, fundamentally, it arises from staring mortality and randomness right in the face. Now, the text does say the crisis is not purely negative. I grant you that. But the ultimate goal, and this is crucial,
is stated as learning to live meaningfully within it. That phrasing, within it, strongly suggests to me that the tension is managed, maybe embraced, possibly endured, but not fully resolved or overcome just by ticking off stages of self-authorship. If the aim is living within this arbitrary reality, then the pain, the tension, it remains a kind of baseline reality of being conscious. It's constantly challenging any illusion of stable self-integration. And another thing, if this is such a universal catalyst for positive growth, why do we see so many examples, even cited in the psychological studies within the material, of individuals collapsing into debilitating nihilism?
They don't seem to successfully navigate your 4-stage roadmap. Nihilism feels like a pretty common outcome of this supposed breakthrough moment, doesn't it?
That's a really crucial observation about nihilism, actually, and I would frame it as evidence for the roadmap, not against it. Hear me out. The pain serves a vital, functional role, as I said, by compelling consciousness. You bring up nihilism? Well, I'd suggest that nihilism isn't the end result of the crisis, but perhaps an arrested stage of development. It's a failure, perhaps, to progress past that very first step, finding yourself. Because to move from finding yourself to the next stage, making yourself, you don't just recognize the pain of meaninglessness, you have to actively choose to imbue existence with meaning, through willful action, through choice. The pain is the necessary shock, the jolt that prevents us from just drifting along in inertia. It forces us, compels us to question those inherited values, those assumptions about life. It's very much like the traditional story of the Buddha's awakening, right?
Seeing sickness, aging and death, that profound confrontation with suffering. That pain was a universal turning point precisely because it demanded engagement. It demanded a structured response, a path. Without that initial pain, the drive toward agency, toward choosing, might never be triggered, leaving the individual stuck in that reactive mode of living. So, the crisis is defined by the transformation it makes possible. That's the breakthrough. And just to clarify that transformation, and maybe address your point about structural certainty, let's quickly unpack that roadmap again. So, finding yourself is recognizing the pain, seeing the limits of external value systems. Then making yourself, this is the active, intentional part, shaping identity through new choices, adopting values. That's the heavy lifting of real freedom. Then becoming yourself is about integrating those choices, weaving them into a coherent personal narrative where your actions start to align with your chosen principles. And finally, being yourself is presented as the sustained state of authenticity that emerges. This structure, I argue, provides a coherent direction. It helps integrate those chosen values, and the material points out this actually parallels what we see in developmental psychology, particularly during adolescence. That's often when individuals realize both their limitations, that's contingency, and their freedoms, arbitrariness. That realization often generates the crisis, yes, but it simultaneously confirms that this is a predictable, or at least understandable, cognitive shift towards agency. This supports the idea that the roadmap has utility in navigating the initial shock.
Okay, that's a compelling argument for the aspiration of that developmental shift. I can see that. But I have to bring it back to the sheer concrete weight of contingency and how much it seems to resist the kind of neat coherence implied by becoming yourself. I mean, we didn't choose our genes, right? Or our starting economic position or the historical era we happen to live in. How much arbitrary choice can realistically overcome the brute facts of what has already been done to us? Think about, say, chronic genetic illness or growing up in a situation of pervasive systemic violence. No amount of self-authored meaning-making is going to just erase those fundamental givens. The roadmap suggests we can integrate choices into a stable, coherent self, but that feels, well, profoundly aspirational, maybe even a bit illusory when faced with our concrete, inescapable facticity, as the existentialists call it. The material even mentions Sartre's famous nausea of existence, that visceral, physical confrontation with the raw, arbitrary, almost excessive reality of just being, that gelatinous stuff he talks about. This experience of pure, unchosen being, it seems to just remain. It demands attention, and it actively challenges the coherence of any identity we try to construct, regardless of how structured the map is. The burden of just being, it feels unavoidable,
and it constantly threatens to undermine the kind of stability you're suggesting is achievable.
I definitely see why you'd emphasize that, focusing on the sheer material weight of our facticity. But let me offer perhaps a slightly different perspective on agency here. Self-authorship, as it's defined in this context, it isn't about magically eliminating contingency. It's about creating meaningful distance from it, or perhaps choosing one's stance towards it. Look, an individual can't change their historical moment. They can't change their genetic code. True. But they absolutely can choose their attitude towards those constraints, and crucially, their response to them. The crisis forces this realization. While contingency might define our starting line, arbitrariness defines our capacity for, well, transcendence, in a way, for choosing despite the givens. If the crisis were simply a permanent, static tension, as you suggest, wouldn't we just be condemned to passivity? Paralyzed by it? The very idea of a breakthrough implies a capacity to transform the reality of what has been done to us into the chosen meaning of what we will do about it. The roadmap, then, isn't magic. It simply provides a necessary framework, a psychological structure for turning that often terrifying freedom into actual lived direction.
Okay, but this transformation you describe, it relies very heavily on the promise of successful ongoing integration, which, frankly, I still find a bit suspect. Let's really scrutinize this idea of being yourself. If every single choice we make to define ourselves, essentially to escape the sheer arbitrariness of pure freedom, is itself just another arbitrary imposition of will onto a fundamentally meaningless universe, well, isn't the core tension just recreated with every decision we make? The source material itself suggests that every religion, every philosophy, can be seen as an attempt to answer this fundamental human tension between the arbitrary and the contingent. If that's the case, doesn't that strongly imply that the tension itself is the enduring foundational human state? My whole approach comes from the premise that the crisis isn't just the prerequisite for philosophy, it's the constant backdrop against which all our meaning-making inevitably occurs.
It's the perpetual subject, the ongoing condition, because every single day we wake up, we have to confront that potential nausea again and remake our choices. That freedom and that facticity, they never truly stabilize into a final state of being yourself.
Well, I have to challenge that definition of the crisis as merely a static, permanent condition. Because if it were just the background hum of existence, why call it a crisis? Why call it a breakthrough? It would just be existence. The material is quite explicit, stating the crisis is the beginning of philosophy itself. That universality, that emphasis on self-awareness, it strongly implies a forward dynamic movement. It's a defining moment that demands engagement, demands a response. And the goal of self-authorship, as I read it, isn't about reaching some static point of satisfaction, it's about dynamic integration. Yes, we must perpetually remake choices, absolutely. But the core shift in agency, that move from passively receiving values to actively choosing them, that feels irreversible once the breakthrough actually occurs. The integration achieved in those later stages, becoming and being, provides the necessary stability, the psychological foundation to handle the daily remaking of choices without collapsing back into that nihilistic void you mentioned earlier. It transforms the initial confusion and pain into meaningful signs of awareness, which is, by definition, what a breakthrough is, a critical moment leading to a permanent new capacity, a new way of orienting oneself.
I understand the emphasis you're placing on transformation, but that breakthrough capacity, it seems to me, must be in constant, active retreat from the sheer weight of contingency. Let's think about the source material's discussion of bad faith. Sartre defines bad faith, essentially, as trying to escape our freedom by adopting rigid social roles or fixed definitions of ourselves, right? Pretending we don't have a choice. Now, if your roadmap leads to a stable state called being yourself, isn't there a significant risk that this state just becomes a new, more sophisticated form of bad faith? An internally constructed fixed identity that's designed precisely to avoid the anxiety of perpetual choice, to avoid confronting the unchosen nature of our existence? The real value of the crisis for me is that it strips away these very illusions of fixity. If the breakthrough simply leads us to build an internal structure
that acts as a substitute for the external structures we've shed, well, aren't we just recreating the same anxiety avoidance mechanism the crisis was supposed to cure in the first place?
That is a very sharp point, I concede, regarding the potential risk of a kind of internal bad faith. I would counter, though, by differentiating between a rigid, predefined self-concept, which would be bad faith, and an authentically chosen, integrated identity that remains open to revision. The stability in being yourself, as I understand it from the material, isn't about rigidity, it's about coherence. It's the coherence that comes from integrating choices over time, while knowing that those choices are ultimately self-imposed and therefore must be perpetually re-examined and reaffirmed. The roadmap, importantly, guides us towards choosing our values after the confrontation with the void, not simply adopting a new set of rules uncritically. Look, if the crisis were purely defined by this persistent, irresolvable tension you focus on, the only truly logical outcome would seem to be paralysis or maybe despair. The sheer evidence of human meaning-making throughout history, the creation of philosophy, art, science, civilization itself, strongly suggests that the crisis is, perhaps almost universally, a functional catalyst. It forces a move toward agency. We seem compelled to create meaning out of the void, and the structure outlined simply describes how that creative process might be managed psychologically.
Okay, then perhaps we can agree on that fundamental compulsion to create meaning. My core concern, though, remains about the nature and the permanence of that creation. If we fully accept that the crisis reveals the fundamental arbitrariness and contingency of our existence, that there really is no stable ground beneath our feet, then maybe our ongoing effort shouldn't be aimed at achieving a stable state, but focus squarely on the rigorous, often painful, management of that unstable state. It's about accepting that the tension is the ground, and that any stability we feel is temporary, contingent, a product of willful assertion that needs constant renewal. If we insist that the crisis ultimately leads to a resolved stage of being yourself, we risk minimizing the profound daily psychological effort required just to resist the constant pull of the absurd, the ever-present possibility of meaninglessness. The very fact that the nausea, as Sartre called it, can always return, that suggests the tension is permanent. It is the human condition, not simply a challenge to be decisively overcome and left behind.
All right. To summarize my perspective then, the existential crisis, as presented, is essentially a powerful, perhaps even necessary call to growth. It utilizes the experience of pain, not gratuitously, but as a crucial trigger for consciousness, shifting us from a passive existence defined by external factors to one of active agency. The roadmap towards self-authorship outlined in the material shows that this confrontation with freedom and suffering, however difficult, is the essential, unavoidable step towards living authentically. It's about transitioning from simply receiving life to actively, consciously creating it.
And to summarize my view, while I absolutely agree the crisis generates critical reflection and initiates that vital search for meaning, I maintain that the inherent structural tension between contingency, what's given, and arbitrariness, our terrifying freedom, is what makes the crisis a permanent, defining feature of human existence, not just a phase. Therefore, the focus must remain on the rigorous, conscious management of this painful, uncertain state. It's about accepting that meaning must be lived within this arbitrary reality, constantly reaffirmed, rather than aspiring to somehow transcend or definitively resolve the core conflict of existence itself through a structured, stabilizing developmental map.
Well, this discussion certainly confirms that the search for meaning, driven by this profound existential confrontation with mortality, freedom, and our own limitations, offers incredible complexity. I think the real value lies in engaging with both sides, the often painful reality of our limitations and the tremendous potential and burden of our agency to fully appreciate the challenging, intricate nature of the human condition. There's clearly more to explore here,